I knew something was wrong the moment my son whispered, "Don't tell the neighbors you're my mother." He said it quickly, barely moving his lips, like he was afraid someone might hear, as if I were a secret, a blemish on the image he had carefully constructed. It wasn't an accident. He made sure no one would overhear. I didn't ask him why. I didn't ask anything at all. I just smiled politely at the man in golf shorts who was watering his perfect lawn and waved, like I was supposed to, like a visitor, like a stranger. The kind of stranger who didn't matter, whose presence would disappear as quickly as it had come. It had been a long flight from Oregon to Connecticut, 2 planes and a bumpy taxi ride, and I was stiff from the journey. My knees ached with every step, but I didn't complain. I never have. Not when I worked double shifts at the clinic, not when I paid for his college, not when I signed the papers for the house he now led me into like I was some casual acquaintance. When we walked through the front door, it was clear to me that this was not my home anymore, that the house he had bought was a statement, a stage set for the life he had chosen, a life that no longer included me in any meaningful way. "Take your shoes off here," Daniel said, his voice polite but distant, as he ushered me inside. Carla, his wife, had already had the floors polished, and I was to respect that. My shoes, old and worn, were a burden here, out of place in a space that had been so carefully curated to look effortless. As if it were a place where nothing real ever happened, just a series of polished surfaces designed to reflect the perfect life. No room for dirt, no room for history, and certainly no room for me. I bent slowly, unzipping my walking shoes, feeling the years in my bones, the aching joints, the slow movements. I felt the cold air of the house as it washed over me, as though I were walking through a museum. The walls gleamed with expensive paint, the furniture sharp and angular, each piece chosen for its design, its status, not for comfort. There were no pictures of Daniel as a child, not a single photograph of the woman who had raised him, not one hint of the woman I used to be in his life. I walked into the living room, which was beautiful, I'll give them that. The space was quiet, a silence that seemed to hang like a thick curtain, one that kept me from stepping too far in. The neutral colors, the sharp corners of the furniture, everything was meticulously curated like it belonged to a glossy magazine spread, but it didn't belong to me. I wasn't invited here in the way a mother should be. I was just a guest, and not even a welcome one. There wasn't a single photo of Daniel and me, not from when he was small, not from the school plays or the birthday parties. Nothing. Not even a trace of the years I had poured into him. I was nothing in this house except an accessory to the life he had built for himself. "Where should I put this?" I asked, holding up a tin of raspberry scones I had baked for him, a gift from home, the kind of thing a mother might bring to her son when visiting. I had baked them, as I had when he was little, because I knew how much he loved them, even if now they seemed too humble, too ordinary for his new life. "Oh, just leave it on the counter," Carla said, barely looking up from the phone she was holding in one hand. "We're doing gluten-free now. The kids might want some the kids. The stepchildren from her first marriage, who were already running upstairs, barely acknowledging me. Their world had no space for me, and it was clear that they didn't care to get to know me. I followed Daniel down the hallway as he led me to the guest room, where I would sleep. It wasn't my room. It wasn't even a room for someone who belonged. It was a room for a guest, clean, sparse, and cold, with nothing personal. Just a bed, a small suitcase, stand like a hotel, and a nightstand with a card that read, Welcome guests. Wi-Fi password. Thorn House 1. It was meant to be a joke, but it felt like a joke at my expense. I didn't belong here. This house was their life, their future, not mine. I had helped buy it, helped them build this life, but now I was an afterthought, a relic of a past they had long since outgrown. "I'll unpack later," I said, sitting slowly on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on me. Daniel hovered in the doorway for a moment, then said, "Just try to relax tonight. It's mostly Carla's circle. You know, doctors, architects, that crowd." "Of course," I said. "What I meant was, I understand. I understand that I'm not supposed to speak too much, not supposed to say who I am. I'm just window dressing. An ornament in the background of their life." I watched as he turned and left the room, closing the door gently behind him, like it was an afterthought. I stayed sitting there, looking at the blank white walls of the guest room. The emptiness felt like a weight, but it wasn't a weight I could express. I couldn't cry. I couldn't protest. I could only sit there like I was waiting for something. What exactly, I didn't know. Maybe for him to come back and tell me that everything was fine, that I wasn't just a relic of a time he had no interest in. But he didn't come back. Instead, I pulled out the envelope from my purse, the one I had been holding on to, the one that held the deed to the house. The house he had begged me to co-sign for him, the house I had paid for in full, with the money I'd saved over the years. It wasn't a gift. It was an investment. He had told me that it was just a formality, that it was for the family, it was for the future. But as I held the envelope, the deed inside, I realized that I was a placeholder. My name was on that document, but it wasn't mine anymore. It was a token for a life he wanted me to believe in. But when I looked around this house where I no longer belonged, it became clear. I wasn't part of the life he had built. I had never been part of it. I tucked the envelope back into my purse and closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the years I had given to him. Years of sacrifice. Years of love. All for what? So I could be left standing at the edge of a perfect lawn, treated like a stranger in my own son's home. Tomorrow, I thought, I would take a walk. Tomorrow, I would try to find some peace in this house that no longer welcomed me. But for tonight, I would sit. I would stay silent. Because that's what they expected of me. And somehow, that was the hardest part. Being ignored in the house I had helped build. Being erased in the life I had once been so proud to share with my son. The day I received the results, I felt a strange mixture of dread and indifference. My son had insisted we take the DNA test, claiming it was for health reasons. Something about understanding genetic predispositions, something about family history. I didn't question him at the time. After all, he had always been the one to make decisions for the family, even when I was the one doing most of the work. It was the usual pattern. He came up with an idea, and I followed along without much thought. This, however, would be different. I didn't know it yet, but the envelope I held in my hand would change everything. The test results arrived in a thick white envelope, the kind used for formal documents. It looked official, like something that might hold the answers to life's biggest questions. For a moment, I stared at the envelope in my hands, feeling a lump form in my throat. My son had insisted I take the test, and now, here it was. The truth, sealed in this envelope. I couldn't help but wonder if the truth was something I was ready for, if the truth was something I was prepared to face. But there was no turning back now. "Go ahead and open it, Mom," Daniel had said, when he handed it to me, as though it were nothing more than a formality. But I didn't think it was a formality. I had spent a lifetime raising him, loving him, being his mother in every sense that mattered. Yet, I had always known, deep down, that something was off. I had seen the subtle changes in him over the years, the way he had grown distant, the way he no longer needed me in the same way. It wasn't just the passing of time. It wasn't just the natural drift of life. It was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. That evening, alone in my room, I opened the envelope. The contents were simple: a few pages of medical jargon, a list of genetic markers, and a result at the bottom, highlighted in bold letters. As I scanned the page, my heart sank. It wasn't just a medical test. It was a confirmation of what I had feared all along. I wasn't his biological mother. I never had been. There it was, in black and white, the undeniable truth. And in that moment, I felt a sudden clarity, a deep understanding that I had been living a lie. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the page in my hands, trying to make sense of what it all meant. The words blurred before my eyes, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. My mind raced, trying to process the shock. I had given him everything. I had nurtured him from the moment he was born, loved him through every stage of his life. And yet, the person I had spent decades caring for, the one who had once called me Mom, wasn't mine. Not by blood. The truth felt cold, like ice settling in the pit of my stomach. I wasn't just a mother who had been forgotten. I was a mother who had never been chosen. The realization hit harder than I could have imagined. This wasn't some minor oversight. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, calculated decision made long before the test was ever taken. And I had been complicit, too, in my own silence. I had known the distance between us was growing, but I had never questioned it. I had just kept giving, kept loving, kept believing that one day things would change. But they hadn't. They wouldn't. The truth was, Daniel had never truly seen me. Not as his mother. Not as the woman who had given him everything, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. He had seen me as a tool, a means to an end. And now, I was a tool he no longer needed. It was as if the moment he had gotten what he wanted, the moment he had gotten the life he had worked so hard for, he no longer had any use for me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear up the test results and throw them in his face. But what good would it do? What would it change? Nothing, I realized. Nothing would change. The damage had already been done, and I had been blind to it all along. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had been living in a fantasy. I had believed that I was his mother in every sense of the word. I had believed that our bond was irreplaceable. But to him, it wasn't. It never had been. I was just a placeholder in his life, a person who had been there when he needed me, but who would now be discarded when I no longer served a purpose. The anger bubbled inside me, a quiet storm of rage that I couldn't release. I didn't want to be angry at him. I didn't want to feel this coldness towards the son I had raised, the son I had loved so fiercely. But the truth was undeniable. I had given him everything, and in return, he had taken it all for granted. He had erased me from his life long before the test had come back. long before I even knew the truth. I thought of the times I had reached out to him, the phone calls that went unanswered, the invitations that went unacknowledged. I thought of the years I had spent waiting for him to come home, waiting for him to see me, waiting for him to love me the way I had loved him. But those years were gone, and now I was left with nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal. I folded the test results and shoved them into the envelope. I didn't need to read them again. I didn't need to see the truth laid out so plainly before me. The truth was already here, in my chest, in my heart, and it hurt more than any piece of paper ever could. For a moment, I sat in silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on me. The world outside my window was still, the sky a deep shade of blue as the evening descended. But inside, everything had changed. The world I had known, the world I had built, had shattered. I was no longer the mother I had thought I was. I was nothing more than a woman who had been forgotten, a woman who had been cast aside. And yet, even in the face of this overwhelming truth, I found myself wondering if there was still a chance for me to find my own peace, my own purpose. If I could move on from this, if I could rebuild my life, even without him. The test results were just the beginning. They were the catalyst, the spark that would set off a chain of events I couldn't yet comprehend. But one thing was clear. I was no longer his mother. And in that moment, I realized that I had to be something more than the woman he had left behind. I had to find myself again. I had to rediscover who I was outside of the role I had been forced to play for so long. I stood up from the bed and walked to the window. The night was falling, but I didn't feel the familiar weight of darkness closing in. Instead, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The truth had been revealed, and now I had a choice. I could stay in the shadows of my past, or I could step into the light of my own future. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure which path I would choose. But one thing was certain. I would no longer be anyone's secret. In the days that followed the revelation of the DNA test, life did not erupt into drama the way one might expect from a betrayal of that magnitude. Instead, it unraveled slowly, like a seam loosening on a garment you had worn for years. Threads, pulling apart, not with a sudden rip, but with the faint, persistent sound of quiet tearing, impossible to stop once it had begun. At first, there were no confrontations, no shouting matches, no tears even. There was only silence, deliberate and suffocating, a silence that pressed itself into the corners of my son's house, like an unwelcome guest who would not leave. Daniel avoided my eyes more than usual. His voice clipped when he spoke to me, as though I had become not just inconvenient, but irrelevant. An unnecessary presence taking up oxygen in rooms he wished were empty. Carla was worse. She had always been polite, brittle, managing her tone like one manages fine china. But after the envelope had been opened, she abandoned even that veneer. She no longer looked at me when I spoke, no longer bothered to pretend I belonged in their carefully arranged home. If she acknowledged me at all, it was in the way one acknowledges furniture that blocks the path, an obstacle, not a person. I noticed changes, not dramatic at first, but unmistakable in their intent. In the living room, the photographs on the mantel shifted. At first, I thought it was just rearrangement, Carla's obsession with aesthetics. But soon I realized that every image that contained me had been removed. There had been a framed picture of me holding my granddaughter on her first birthday. Her small hand clutching the collar of my sweater while she smeared frosting across her face, both of us laughing. It had been placed near the family Bible, a central object in the room. One day, it was gone. When I asked Daniel about it, he muttered something about redecorating, about Carla preferring a more modern look, but his eyes flickered with a discomfort that told me the truth. The picture had not been misplaced. It had been erased, intentionally, like I was being rubbed out of the family's memory. Soon, every album I opened seemed thinner, pages where my presence had once been carefully documented now missing, photos stripped out with neat precision. It was as if Carla were rewriting history, and Daniel allowed it. The cruelty did not arrive in grand gestures, but in daily omissions, small absences that added up until I felt invisible even when I sat at the kitchen table among them. Meals were prepared without a place set for me. I had to reach into the cupboards myself, pull out a plate, and seat myself, while Carla spoke over me as though my chair were empty. Invitations to family outings, once extended half-heartedly, ceased altogether. They began to speak of plans in hushed tones, glancing at each other when I entered the room, stopping conversations mid-sentence, then resuming once I passed. I learned of birthdays and school events only after the fact, mentioned casually by my step-grandchildren in a way that stung, because I realized they no longer thought of me as someone who should have been included in the first place. The worst came when my granddaughter, the youngest, brought home an assignment from school. She had been tasked with drawing her family tree. She laid it proudly on the table, colored in bright markers, names written carefully in block letters. My eyes scanned the branches, expecting to see myself there, as I always had been. Grandmother, part of the root system that had supported them all. But when I looked closely, my name was missing. In my place was a blank space, left unmarked, or perhaps deliberately avoided. I asked her softly, trying to mask the trembling in my voice. "Where am I, darling?" She glanced at her mother before answering. Carla leaned in quickly and said, "She's still learning. We'll add it later if it fits. If it fits." As though family were a matter of aesthetic arrangement, as though my existence were optional, conditional, a puzzle piece that might or might not belong. The child's innocent eyes looked confused, as if she had been instructed not to say more. In that moment, I realized my erasure was no accident. It was deliberate, orchestrated, and the younger generation was being trained to see me as unnecessary. Nights in that house grew unbearable. I lay in the sterile guest room, the air heavy with lavender from Carla's diffusers, the bed too stiff, the walls too bare, and I felt like a ghost haunting a place where I was still alive. I heard them laugh together downstairs, glasses clinking, voices overlapping, and I thought of the decades when I had been the one hosting gatherings, the one providing warmth, food, and presents. Now, I was excluded in my own investment. I remembered the envelope with the deed tucked in my purse, the quiet proof that I had helped build this life, that I had poured my money and years of savings into this house. And yet, here I was, treated as though I were a tenant overstaying a temporary lease, a stranger hovering in the background of their perfect tableau. The isolation seeped into me, reshaping the contours of my days. I began to walk more, leaving the house for long stretches because it was easier to wander aimlessly through unfamiliar neighborhoods than to sit among people who pretended I wasn't there. I lingered in grocery stores, ran errands that didn't need running, simply to avoid being in that space where every glance, every omission reminded me of my diminishing existence. When I returned, My absence went unnoticed. No one asked where I had been, whether I had eaten, whether I was tired. I might as well have been invisible. And invisibility is a crueler punishment than hostility, because it strips you not just of belonging, but of proof that you exist at all. I tried, in quiet moments, to confront Daniel. Once, over morning coffee, I asked him why my name had not been included in the family records, why my granddaughter's tree had left me off. He shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting away. "Mom, don't make a big deal out of this. Kids get confused. It doesn't mean anything, but it did." His voice lacked conviction, his hands fidgeted. His tone carried the weight of someone who knew the truth, but did not want to face it. I pressed no further, because what was the point? His silence told me more than his words ever could. Gradually, I withdrew. I stopped offering to cook meals, stopped bringing small gifts, stopped trying to fill the silences with cheerful conversation. I became a shadow in their home, a presence tolerated but not embraced. The distance grew thicker, and yet, paradoxically, I felt a seed of strength begin to take root inside me. If they were going to erase me, then I would stop trying to carve my name into a tree that had already cut off my branch. I began to think of leaving, of carving out a space where I was not erased, where my presence did not need justification. The thought frightened me and freed me in equal measure. The first escalation, then, was not an argument, not a slammed door or a shouted insult. It was the quiet, methodical erasure of my existence from their lives. A campaign carried out with politeness and silence, a cruelty so measured it almost appeared invisible to outsiders. But I felt every cut, every omission, every blank space on the family tree where my name should have been. And those small wounds accumulated until they became unbearable, until the truth was unavoidable. I was no longer part of this family, not in their eyes. The test results had not just confirmed a biological truth. They had become a weapon, a tool used to exclude me, to justify what they had already begun to do long before. And as I sat in that guest room night after night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled hum of their lives carrying on without me, I realized that this was only the beginning. Something inside me shifted. I would not beg to remain where I was unwanted. I would not fight to cling to branches that had been cut. I would, in time, step away. But for now, I endured the silence, because endurance was something I had mastered. The question was no longer whether they wanted me. It was whether I wanted to keep disappearing in front of them, or whether I would one day decide to walk away and reclaim what was left of myself. In the weeks that followed, something inside me began to change. The weight of the realization that I had been forgotten, excluded, erased from the lives of the people I had once given everything to, started to settle within me like a heavy stone. At first, I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that perhaps I was overreacting, that maybe I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. It was happening. Slowly but unmistakably, I had become irrelevant to them. And as painful as it was to admit, I realized I had allowed it to happen. I had allowed myself to become small, to disappear under the guise of love, to shrink into the background of my own life. One afternoon, after a particularly strained dinner where we sat in silence, each of us pretending that nothing was wrong, I decided that something had to change. I had spent too long waiting, too long hoping that things would somehow go back to the way they had been. But they wouldn't. They never would. The family I had known, the family I had built, was no longer the same, and no amount of waiting, no amount of sacrifice would bring that version back. I couldn't live in the shadows anymore, trying to force myself into a role that no longer fit. It was time to step out into the light, even if that meant walking away from everything I had known. That night, I sat by the window in my room, the cool air from the cracked glass brushing against my face. I looked out at the quiet street, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. It was late, and the house was still. It was always still now, a stark contrast to the way it used to be. I thought about my life, about the years I had spent raising Daniel, about all the sacrifices I had made for him. I thought about the things I had given up, the parts of myself that had been lost along the way. Somewhere along the line, I had forgotten to take care of myself, to remember that I mattered just as much as anyone else. Somewhere along the line, I had allowed myself to become nothing more than a mother, a grandmother, a caretaker, and nothing else. But that wasn't who I was. That wasn't all that I was. I had to remember who I was beyond those roles. The thought of leaving had crossed my mind before, but it always seemed impossible. I had no idea where I would go, what I would do, or how I would start over. But that night, something clicked inside me. I didn't need to know everything. I didn't need to have all the answers. I just needed to take the first step. And that was the hardest part. The part where you realize you've been holding on to something that was never yours to begin with, and you finally let go. The next morning, I went for a walk. It wasn't a long walk. I didn't go anywhere in particular. I simply needed to move, to feel the air against my skin, to remind myself that I was still here, that I was still alive, and that there was more to life than waiting for people who didn't see me. I passed by the park where I had taken Daniel when he was young, where we had spent afternoons playing catch, where I had cheered for him at every school game. The park was empty now, the grass overgrown, the swings swaying in the wind. I stopped for a moment, watching the emptiness around me. It was as though time had moved on without me, leaving me behind in a world that no longer had a place for me. But then I thought of all the things I still wanted to do, all the things I had put off for too long, and I realized that I didn't have to wait for permission to live. That afternoon, I found myself standing outside a small coffee shop that I had passed by many times, but never had the courage to enter. Something about it had always felt inviting, yet foreign, like a small piece of the world that didn't belong to my family. A place where I could be myself, where no one knew my history, where no one would look at me with pity or disdain. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warm scent of coffee and baked goods filled the air, and I immediately felt a sense of calm wash over me. I ordered a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the people go by, each of them lost in their own world, their own lives. I felt a twinge of jealousy, but it wasn't a jealousy born of resentment. It was the kind of jealousy that comes from realizing that you've allowed your own life to slip away without truly living it. As I sat there, sipping my tea, I realized that this was the beginning. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic escape. It was simply the act of choosing to be present in my own life again. I didn't need to know all the answers. I didn't need to have everything figured out. I just needed to start living, to stop waiting for someone else to make me feel important, to stop waiting for someone else to see me. Later that day, I went to the library. It was a place I hadn't been in years, a place where I used to lose myself in books, in stories, in worlds beyond my own. The library was quiet, the smell of old pages and dust filling the air. I wandered through the aisles, running my fingers along the spines of the books, looking for something to read, something that would remind me of who I had once been. I picked up a novel, one I had read long ago, and sat in one of the chairs by the window. As I opened the first page, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. This was mine. This moment. This life. I wasn't anyone's mother or grandmother or caregiver. I was simply a woman sitting in a library, reading a book. It was a small act, but it was a powerful one. It reminded me that I still had the ability to make choices, to carve out a space for myself in the world, even if that space was small, even if it was just a chair in a library. I didn't need permission. I didn't need to be validated by anyone. I just needed to be. When I returned home that evening, I felt lighter, as though something inside me had shifted. I didn't know where this new path would lead, but I knew I was no longer waiting for anyone to tell me what to do. I was going to find my own way, even if it meant stepping away from the family I had tried so hard to hold on to. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to stay in the background anymore. I wasn't going to let myself be erased from the story of my life. It wasn't going to be easy, and I didn't know what the future held. But I was ready to stop pretending, ready to stop shrinking, and ready to finally live on my own terms. That was my turning point. That was when everything began to shift. No more waiting, no more pretending. I was going to take the first step toward freedom, toward reclaiming my life. I didn't know how it would look, but I knew it had to start now. The weeks after that day at the library, when I first realized that I had the ability to choose my own path again, felt like a slow burn, each moment simmering with the quiet promise of something new, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I wasn't just existing anymore. I was starting to live. It wasn't the kind of life I had once envisioned, the perfect, ordered existence I had built around my family. No, this new life felt raw, uncertain, and, at times, terrifying. But it was mine, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, I wasn't waiting for someone to tell me who I was supposed to be. But the moment I thought I could finally breathe freely, when I imagined myself stepping away from the tangled web of their expectations, from the roles I had been forced to play for so long, that's when it all started to fall apart. Not in the dramatic way I had expected, not with accusations or confessions, not with heated words. No, it began quietly, with a phone call. A phone call from a lawyer telling me that Daniel and Carla were concerned about me, about my well-being, and that they wanted to discuss things. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe they were calling to ask me to return some forgotten item or to discuss a trivial family matter. But the lawyer's voice, calm and measured, told me otherwise. He mentioned that they had been trying to reach me, and when I didn't answer, they had felt obligated to get professional advice. They wanted to make sure I was in a safe environment. They wanted to make sure I wasn't endangering myself. At first, I was taken aback. I had been living on my own, making decisions for myself, and for all the pain I had endured, I had felt a sense of control over my life again. But here was this lawyer, speaking to me like I was some kind of fragile creature who needed to be handled carefully, as if I couldn't be trusted to take care of myself. My anger flared before I even realized it, and I had to swallow hard to keep my voice steady when I responded. "I'm fine," I said. I don't need anyone to check on me. I'm not some project that needs rescuing." The lawyer hesitated for a moment, as though considering his next words. "It's just that they're worried, ma'am," he said, and the words lingered in the air like a cloud of condescension. "Your son and his wife. They just want to make sure you're okay." I ended the call abruptly, the echo of his words still ringing in my ears. How dare they? How dare they think that they could swoop in with their concern after everything that had happened? The truth was, they weren't worried about me. They weren't concerned with my safety, my well-being, or my happiness. They were worried that I might be a threat to their carefully constructed image, that I might disrupt the perfect family narrative they had spent years creating. That's all it was. A performance, a show, and I was no longer playing the part they wanted me to. And it terrified them. In the days that followed, my sense of quiet rebellion began to shift into something more insistent, more fierce. I knew that this wasn't just about a lawyer's phone call or a series of unanswered messages. This was about control. This was about them trying to dictate the terms of my life, trying to drag me back into their world, into the role they had created for me. The obedient mother, the dutiful grandmother. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I couldn't be. And so, with a quiet resolve, I took the next step. I began to make plans, not the kind of plans that involved them or their expectations, but the kind of plans that would allow me to stand on my own 2 feet, to carve out a space where I could exist without having to answer to anyone. The first thing I did was make sure I had a place to stay. I had been renting my small apartment above the laundromat for months, but I hadn't fully settled into it. I hadn't allowed myself to believe that this was my life now, but it was, and so I began to make it mine. I took down the old, faded wallpaper, replaced the worn-out curtains with something lighter, something that felt like spring. I bought a small plant, something green to remind me that I was still growing, even in the midst of everything that had happened. I put up a picture of my own, a photograph of me with my old friends at a summer barbecue years ago, back when I still had a sense of who I was beyond the roles I had played. It was small, simple, but it felt like a declaration, a statement that I was here, that I was still capable of living, of being, of existing on my own terms. But even as I began to settle into this new life, even as I made small changes and adjusted to the rhythms of my own solitude, I couldn't escape the pressure they were putting on me. The phone calls continued. Daniel and Carla called, left messages, sent emails, all with the same tone of forced concern. They wanted me to come back to Wilmington to see a counselor, to work things out with them. They wanted me to come to some kind of family meeting where we could all talk about what had happened and how we could move forward. But I knew what they really wanted. They didn't want to resolve anything. They wanted me to submit. They wanted me to apologize for being difficult, for daring to walk away from the life they had planned for me. They wanted me to fall back in line. The more they pushed, the more I resisted. I had spent my entire life bending to their will, adjusting myself to fit their expectations, and I wasn't about to do it again. I began to shut them out. The phone remained unanswered. The emails went unread, and slowly, as the silence between us grew, I began to feel a strange kind of relief. It was as though I had stepped out of a suffocating fog, and now I could breathe again. But the pressure didn't stop. One evening, while I was sitting on the small porch outside my apartment, enjoying the quiet of the neighborhood, I saw a car pull up across the street. I didn't recognize it at first, but then the door opened, and I saw Daniel step out, followed by Carla. They were standing at the edge of my yard, looking like they had come to deliver some kind of message. My heart sank, and for a moment, I considered running inside, pretending I hadn't seen them. But I didn't. I stood up, walked to the gate, and met them halfway. "I don't need this," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I don't need your concern, your control, your apologies. I've made my decision. I'm done." Daniel looked at me, his face a mix of confusion and frustration. "Mom, please. We're just trying to understand. This isn't like you. You've always been there for us. Always. Why are you doing this?" I shook my head. "You've always wanted me to be what you needed me to be. A mother, a grandmother. But I'm not just that. I'm not just a role you can assign. I'm a person, Daniel, and I have my own life now. It's not perfect, but it's mine." Carla stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. "You don't understand, do you? This isn't about us. This is about you. You're breaking the family apart. You're throwing everything away." "No," I said, my voice calm, but my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm simply choosing to stop being the person you want me to be. And for once, I'm going to be the person I need to be. If that means walking away, then so be it." They didn't speak for a long moment. Daniel stood there, his eyes searching mine, as though he were looking for some sign that I would change my mind, that I would come back to them. But I didn't offer him that. I didn't offer him anything. Instead, I turned and walked back toward the porch, leaving them standing in the quiet evening air, where the last remnants of sunlight were slipping away. The next morning, I sat in the small chair by my window, staring out at the street, my heart still racing from the confrontation. But there was no regret, no second guessing. It was hard, harder than I had expected, but it felt like a door had finally closed, and I was no longer waiting for someone to open it for me. I had made my choice, and now there was no going back. The family I had once known, the life I had once built, was no longer mine to hold. But I was free, in a way that I had never been before. And for the first time, I could feel the weight of that freedom settling over me, like a coat that fit just right, one that had been waiting for me to put it on. The breaking point did not come with a scream, or a slammed door, or some furious confrontation in the middle of the night. No, it came with paper. Thin, official, irrefutable paper. One morning, after another sleepless night, filled with the echoes of their accusations that I was abandoning family and losing touch with reality, I went to the lawyer's office alone, the same kind of office I had once stepped into decades earlier, when I had signed my name to give Daniel the future he said he needed, the papers that had bound me to his mortgage, to his house, to his carefully curated life. But this time, I wasn't signing my life away. This time, I was reclaiming it. The young woman at the front desk looked at me curiously, as if wondering why an old woman would be walking in with such steady steps, her coat buttoned high, her purse clutched firmly in her hand. I sat in the waiting area, the hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing above me, the smell of freshly printed documents lingering in the air. When my name was called, I walked into the lawyer's office, the sound of my shoes against the polished floor steady, deliberate, echoing with a kind of resolve I hadn't felt in years. The lawyer, a woman not much older than my daughter-in-law, greeted me with professional courtesy. She had a calm face, neutral in the way people in her line of work must be, but her eyes were sharp, observant. She asked me why I had come, and for a moment I simply sat there, folding and unfolding the edge of my scarf, trying to put words to the storm inside me. Then I told her everything. I told her about the DNA test, about the whispered words, erase her from the family tree, about the photographs that had vanished from the mantel, about the school project where my name had been left off. I told her about the lawyer's call, about the visits, about the pressure to submit, to disappear quietly. My voice shook at times, but I did not stop. And when I was finished, when the room seemed heavy with the weight of all I had carried for too long, she leaned forward and said, "You have the right to decide what happens to your life, to your assets, to your story. You have the right to set boundaries, and you are not required to return to people who diminish you." Those words were simple, but they struck me like a bell. I had the right, not the obligation, not the burden, the right. For so long, I had believed my existence was defined by duty, that my worth was measured by how much of myself I gave away. But here was this stranger reminding me that I had ownership of myself, that I could decide, finally, what was mine and what I would not give anymore. So I signed the papers. I rewrote my will, not in anger, but in clarity. My money, modest as it was, would not pass into the hands of those who sought to erase me. The savings, the small pension, the accounts I had built quietly for decades, would go to the granddaughter who had once curled into my side and whispered, "Grandma, don't ever leave me." And the rest I designated for the library, the place that had given me refuge when no one else would, a place where women like me could sit in the silence and still feel seen. I signed my name carefully, with a hand steadier than it had been in years, because this was not just ink on paper. This was my declaration of self. When the lawyer handed me the final copy, embossed and official, I felt a strange sensation sweep through me, as if some invisible chain had been unlocked. For so long, I had been bound to them by obligations that were never reciprocated, by love that was demanded but never returned. But now, I had put something into the world that was mine, and mine alone. Something that could not be undone by their whispers or erased from their carefully edited photo albums. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the papers spread out before me. I brewed a cup of tea, the steam curling in the cool air, and I read the words slowly, savoring them, letting them sink into me. Each paragraph felt like a step further away from the life that had trapped me. Each signature a cut to the tether that had kept me tied to people who no longer wanted me, except as a silent accessory. And when I finished, I took the test results, the envelope that had once felt like a death sentence, and I set it on a small ceramic dish. I struck a match, held it to the edge, and watched the paper curl and blacken, the letters vanishing into smoke. I did not watch with bitterness. I watched with calm. I kept the envelope, though, empty now, as a reminder that sometimes what remains after the fire is more important than what was burned. The next day, I mailed a letter to Daniel and Carla. It wasn't long, and it wasn't cruel. 3 lines only. I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I am not angry, but I am not coming back. Take care of your life. I have finally begun mine. I folded it carefully, slid it into an envelope, sealed it, and pressed the stamp firmly in place. As I walked to the mailbox, my steps felt light, almost buoyant, though my heart was heavy with the knowledge that I was cutting something final. I slid the letter into the slot, and the clang of it falling inside was the sound of closure, the sound of a door closing gently but firmly, a sound that could not be undone. It was not a victory in the way most people imagine victories. There were no parades, no applause, no visible signs of triumph. It was a quiet victory, the kind that only you can feel in your bones, in the deep places of your soul that have long been silenced. It was the victory of reclaiming the right to exist, the victory of saying no, the victory of choosing peace over performance. That night, I sat by the window again, the street outside dim and silent, and I felt a stillness within me that I had not known in years. They might still talk, still twist the story to suit their version, still play the role of the concerned family to anyone who would listen. But I knew the truth, and the truth was enough. For the first time, I was no longer waiting for them to recognize me, to validate me, to hold me in place on their family tree. I was no longer asking for a seat at a table that had never truly been mine. I had built my own table, small and simple, but sturdy, and I had given myself permission to sit at it. And that, I realized, was the climax of it all. Not that I had cut them out, not that I had burned the test or written the letter, but that I had finally, after so many years, chosen myself. The days after sending the letter passed in a haze, each one marked by a quiet, settling peace that I hadn't known in years. It wasn't a peace born of forgetting, far from it. I wasn't running away from the past. I wasn't burying the hurt or pretending it didn't matter. No, the peace I felt came from the simple act of release, the understanding that, for the first time in a long time, I had made a choice that was mine alone. I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval or permission. I wasn't holding my breath, hoping they would come around and recognize my worth. That part of me was gone, erased not by their actions, but by my own willingness to stop begging for a place at their table. Life, for the most part, went on in its usual way. The mail came. The small neighborhood seemed to hum with its routine, and I continued my walks through the streets, the familiar path now a reminder of my agency, of the life I had taken back for myself. I didn't rush into anything. I didn't push to fill the silence with distractions. The quiet felt right. But even in the stillness, I couldn't completely escape the sense of absence that still lingered around me. It was a strange thing, the feeling of being both invisible and, for the first time, truly free. I thought of Daniel, of his face the last time we spoke, that expression of confusion, as if he couldn't understand why I was making this choice, why I was choosing to leave when all he had ever known was my presence. But that was the problem. My presence had never been enough for him to see me, not truly. And now, in this silence, I could finally see myself. Days turned into weeks, and the mail remained the same. Bills, advertisements, letters that held no meaning to me. But then, one morning, a letter arrived that stood out among the rest. It wasn't from Daniel or Carla, but from Kieran, my grandson. I hadn't heard from him since I left, not directly, though I had kept a watchful eye on his social media posts, the small glances into his life that he would share. He had always been the one who seemed to care the most, who had never let me feel like a burden. I had been waiting for this letter, even though I hadn't known it. It was the kind of letter you don't ask for, but when it arrives, You realize it's the only one that really matters. The envelope was simple, with his name written in familiar, looping handwriting, the kind I had come to recognize from his childhood. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully. The words were short, but they carried more weight than any speech Daniel had ever given me. "Grandma," it started, "I don't know what happened. I don't know why you left, but I need you to know that I miss you. I've been thinking about you a lot, and I don't think I really understood before, but I understand now. I wish I could have been there. I wish I had said something, done something. I know it's probably too late, but I want you to know that you matter, that you've always mattered. I'm coming to see you. I want to talk. I'm not asking for anything, just to see you. I think you know where I'll be." The letter was signed simply, Kieran. I folded the paper carefully and set it down beside me, feeling something shift inside my chest. I wasn't sure what I expected. Part of me had imagined that I would receive a letter like this one day, but it still shocked me, still took my breath away to realize that Kieran, my grandson, the one person who had always seen me, had finally come through. After everything, after all the silence, he had reached out in the most genuine way possible. He wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't pleading for me to come back to the family, to fix things. He was simply asking to be with me, to talk, to share whatever had happened between us. The thought of seeing him filled me with a kind of warmth I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. I hadn't realized how much I had missed him, how much his absence had left a hole in my heart, a space that no amount of independence could fill. I hadn't realized how much I had yearned for the unconditional love of a child who didn't care about the past, who didn't see me as a symbol of failure or of loss, but simply as someone who had always been there. I made the decision right away. I would see him. I didn't know what would happen after that, what words would be exchanged, or how I would feel once we sat face to face. But I knew that this was something I had to do. I wasn't going to let the silence between us grow any longer. I wasn't going to let the years slip away without trying to bridge the gap that had formed between us, not because of anything we had done, but because of what had been done around us. That afternoon, I found the address Kieran had left in his letter. It wasn't far, just a few blocks away from my apartment. The walk was short, but as I made my way through the streets, I felt a tightness in my chest, a nervous excitement that I hadn't felt in a long time. I was going to see him, and I didn't know what that would mean, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was moving towards something instead of away from it. When I arrived at the address, I paused for a moment at the door, letting my hand hover over the doorknob. I didn't know what I was going to say. I didn't know what he would say, but I knew deep down that this moment had been coming for a long time. I opened the door. Kieran was sitting by the window, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as I entered, and for the first time, I saw the man he had become, not the boy I had once held in my arms, but someone just as familiar, just as loved. His eyes softened when he saw me, and without a word, he stood up and walked over. We didn't hug right away. We just stood there facing each other. And then he said, "I'm glad you're here." "I'm glad too," I whispered, feeling something break inside me. Not with sadness, but with relief. With the quiet joy that comes from reconnecting with the only person who had never truly forgotten me. We sat together, not rushing to fill the silence, but letting it sit comfortably between us, as though we both understood that words would come when they needed to. And when they did, they weren't filled with guilt or regret. They were just two people trying to understand each other again. It wasn't about apologies. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about reclaiming a relationship that had never really been lost, only suspended by time, by the actions of others. We didn't talk for hours, but what we said in that brief time was enough. I didn't need to know everything, and he didn't need to explain anything. We had found each other again in the most unexpected way. That day, when I left his apartment, I felt lighter than I had in years. The door that had closed behind me so many months ago had opened again, not to the past, but to something new. It wasn't a return to what had been. It was the beginning of something entirely different, something defined by choice and mutual respect, something built on the understanding that love doesn't require perfection. It only requires presence. As I walked back to my apartment, I realized that the life I had built on my own was no longer just about survival. It was about connection, about the quiet understanding that the relationships that matter are the ones you choose to nurture. And for the first time in a long time, I knew that I had chosen something good.